Hey everybody, this is Owen from Owen's Rock and Metal Podcast, and before we get into the action today, I wanted to take a few seconds to talk about Anchor. Anchor is a great app and it is free to use. It's the easiest way to make a podcast. Did I mention it's free? There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will even distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started today. That's the Anchor app or anchor.fm to get started today. Happy podcasting. And now, let's get into it.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Owen from Owen's Rock and Metal Podcast. Today is episode number 14. Thank you guys for tuning in today. I've got a great show for you today. Today's topic, I'm kind of trying something new today. Normally a breakdown, it's normally an album review where we kind of talk about a certain period in metal history, whether it be, bands from the 70s or hair metal, or like I said, just talking about a specific album. But today, we are talking about not one band, but two bands, and we are doing a face-off, kind of a battle of the bands, so to speak. This is kind of the first time I've done a format like this. I want to hear what you guys think about it. If you guys are a fan of it, please let me know. There are plenty of other topics I could do, plenty of other bands I could kind of break down as in a head-to-head matchup. But today's Battle of the Bands, today's head-to-head matchup is an iconic one. It's a legend between two legendary heavy metal acts, and that is between both British heavy metal bands, if that gives a hint at all. That is between Judas Priest and Iron Maiden. But before we get into that today, I thought I just want to kind of touch on some things going on in the metal world, what I've been listening to lately, and I updated my vinyl collection the other day, so I thought I'd let you guys know about that as well. So just some notes in the metal world news. I don't have too much, but I did want to mention, for those who have not heard, Dave Ellefson is out of Megadeth. He was one of the longtime members in that group, and after the recent scandal involving him, he is out of the band. So I'm not sure who's going to play bass for their tour this summer, but I'm sure they will find somebody. But that is big news if you are into metal or you're a Megadeth fan at all. So Dave Ellefson is out of Megadeth. Who is going to step in? Jason Newsted? Probably not, but somebody will step in, and I'm sure they will be perfectly qualified. A little touch on what I've been listening to lately. So I like to kind of expand my listening horizons every now and again. Last summer, I tried to explore a lot of new music. Last summer was the first time I heard any Pantera, and that rocked my world for sure. So this summer, I'm kind of going to try and do the same, kind of make a list. What I like to do is I make a list of different albums from different groups, and I like to start, if it's a new band, I like to start with their first album and kind of trace their career lineage. So anyway, I made a new list, so some of the bands I've been listening to, Motorhead, I listened to their debut. I've been getting into metal more and more, and, Motorhead is one of the kind of forefathers, one of the OGs, if you will, in the metal genre. So I figured I should dig into them more. So I listened to their first album. I did like what I heard, so I definitely will be checking back in for album number 2, and then and so on and so forth. Ace of Spades is probably the big one that I'm looking forward to. Name escaped me there for a moment, but Ace of Spades is kind of their, in my understanding, is at least it's their biggest album, so that's the one to look out for. I listened to some Sepultura. I listened to their first album. I was shuffling a playlist a few weeks back, and Refuse Resist, that song by Sepultura, came on, and I was like, this is fucking awesome. So I figured, why not explore it? And the sound is vastly different from the track that I had heard to the first album. The first album had more of a death metal kind of thrash vibe to it. So It was good, but I'm interested to see how their career progresses. Cryptic Writings, 1997 release from Megadeth, I checked out as well. I had listened to all of Megadeth's albums up to Cryptic Writings, and I liked Cryptic Writings. At first, I was kind of lukewarm on it, but it slowly grew on me as the days passed. And the next Megadeth album I have to listen to is Risk, and I know Risk has a lot of negative reactions in the fan base. It's kind of compared to as their Saint Anger, so I'll have to check that out in due time. And more modern music that I've been checking out, well, modern rock music that is, I checked out Dirty Honey's latest album. If you're not a fan of Dirty Honey or you're not familiar with Dirty Honey, you should definitely check them out. They are part of this rock revival that we have going on. We have new rock bands coming up like Dirty Honey, Greta Van Fleet, Rival Sons, and so many more that I'm probably not even aware of, but I think it's important that these artists are promoted and their sound and their music is put out there to kind of help spark this rock revival. So that's just some stuff I've been listening to. The rest of the stuff on my list, I want to listen to Volume 3, The Subliminal Verses by Slipknot. I checked out Slipknot's first 2 albums, but I have not gotten to the third one yet, so I'm looking forward to checking that one out. And Motley Crue's second album, Shout at the Devil from 1983. That is on my list as well. And then it'll come time to craft a new list. So if you have something that you think I should put on the list, be sure to let me know. You can message me on Instagram. You can message the podcast page at Owen's Rock and Metal Podcast, all one word. Or you can message me on my personal account, OwenW409. I also keep my vinyl collection, what's going on. I keep that pretty updated. That's another thing I wanted to share. So I am a big Greta Van Fleet fan. They released their new album back in April, and I picked it up on vinyl. Yesterday I picked it up on CD. So I picked it up on vinyl like the day after it was released, and then I picked it up on CD yesterday. I also picked up Kiss's debut album on vinyl in very good condition, and I picked up The Beatles, 1967 to 1970, kind of part of their greatest hits deal, and that was only $10, and it was in very good condition. So those were great finds. Shout out Omega Music in Dayton for bringing those finds to me, helping me, having a great selection to choose from. If you're in the Dayton area and you want to collect vinyls or CDs or even cassettes, check out Omega Music in downtown Dayton in the Oregon District. It is the best place for records in the area, without a doubt. But without further ado, let's get into it today. So, when thinking of a battle of the bands, something that I set out to do first, because I had the idea in my head that this would be a fun topic, pin Judas Priest versus Iron Maiden, and I can kind of create a logical thought process, kind of walk it through, say, why, who is better and why? And at the end of the show today, I will reveal my conclusion, ultimately. Don't worry, I won't leave you with a cliffhanger. But before I really set out to find a conclusion, I wanted to break it down into categories to help provide a justification. So the criteria that I kind of originally was going to go with, I wanted to look at each band's legacy and impact, who had the larger impact. Longevity and consistency was another category I had kind of pondered, but I kind of scratched that one because they've both been around for a very long time, and they both have been pretty consistent in terms of members. I mean, at different points in time, each band had their main lead singer leave, with Bruce Dickinson exiting Iron Maiden at a certain period of time, and Rob Halford exiting Judas Priest at a certain period of time. So they've kind of both gone through periods of members leaving, and they've both gone through a pretty consistent core of members staying around. So they have that similarity, so I thought comparing that category wouldn't really be worthwhile, so I scrapped that category aside. Another one I wanted to look at was general just popularity, which I would measure in sales, and I like to use Spotify, so streams and plays on Spotify is another useful tool that can measure kind of popularity in my eyes. And I kind of scribbled that one out. I'm like, that can kind of go into the legacy category and the impact for sure. And then I wanted to weigh who was the better live act. And I realized there's not a real good way to quantify that. That's really subjective. And me being a 20-year-old kid, I haven't had a lot of chances to see Judas Priest or Iron Maiden, especially since I've really only gotten into their music in the last 12 months or so. So maybe not the best thing for me to speak out on, but they both have several live albums, and they both are legendary in the metal game, so they clearly are a quality live act. I did do research on the live performances, and I took some notes on that, so I can kind of delve into that later. But let's get into it. Judas Priest versus Iron Maiden. Who's the better metal band? Who do I prefer? Who's the greatest metal band? Or, well, not necessarily. This isn't necessarily about who's the greatest metal band of all time, because I don't believe it is either of these two bands. But naming the greatest metal band of all time and figuring out who that is, I think that would be a fun episode to do, and I would like to have some people join me for that. So if you're interested and you're listening, let me know. We can get that in the next cycle. But if we just kind of, like I said, I wanted to look at the legacy of each band. If we just kind of look at each band's legacy and kind of compare and contrast. So if we start with, we'll start with the older of the two bands, which is Judas Priest. Obviously, they're a heavy metal band. They are from England, the UK. They were formed in Birmingham in 1969. So they kind of were innovating and developing their sound throughout the 70s. And then they really strike it large in the 1980s. Their big album, British Steel, in my opinion, that's their best album. It's damn near perfect. It was released in 1980, and then the subsequent releases after it, such as Screaming for Vengeance, Defenders of the Faith, and whatnot, and so on and so forth. Those are some of their quality records. That's where their quality tracks are found. So that's, British Steel. In the 80s, Judas Priest is Judas Priest's biggest, legacy. It's their biggest impact on, heavy metal and music in general. Their impact goes beyond just their music, though. What they wore was incredibly impactful as well. They're often known now for their wearing leather and studs, and that's kind of the image that was other bands wore, because they donned the leather and the studs in the late 70s, which influenced bands in the 80s on the glam scene, as well as the early black metal scene. There was often a lot of leather and studs, which was all related to kind of the underground scene and whatnot. But it helped to have Judas Priest stand out. So their influence can not only be traced in their music, but also their fashion as well. Heavy metal fashion, if you will. But Judas Priest, one of the greatest metal bands of all time. In fact, MTV compiled a list of the greatest metal bands of all time, where Judas Priest ranked number 2, behind Black Sabbath, of course. But that being said, it's still incredibly impactful. The leather, the studs, that impacts the fashion. Their music, they impacted many bands coming up in the 70s. So you think about all the metal bands that came after them. They can owe some credit, maybe, some thanks to Judas Priest impacting their music and sound. Their music has been used in popular culture. The film This Is Spinal Tap from 1984 features, Rob Reiner goes to a Judas Priest concert. Their music has been used in other films and in other instances in pop culture. So yeah, Judas Priest is kind of an institution in the world of metal. They have contributed a wide array, a large discography with, great tracks and great music altogether. But, when it comes to comparing them to Iron Maiden, you could say the exact same thing. So without further ado, let's kind of talk about Maiden for a little bit. So Maiden is also an English heavy metal band, which is kind of, historically, these two are kind of pitted against each other. Oh, are you a Priest guy or a Maiden guy? Or are you a Priest gal or a Maiden gal? Are you a Priest person or a Maiden person? It's age-old comparison. So Maiden forms in 1975, so a few years after Priest, but their first album doesn't come out till 1980, I believe. Let me get that correct, because I don't want to say anything incorrect. So yeah, 1980, their self-titled album, Iron Maiden, is released. Judas Priest's first album comes out before that. I believe 1974's Rock-a-Rolla is the name of it. But let me, once again, get that correct. Yes, 1974, Rock-a-Rolla is when Judas Priest debuts. So Judas Priest has about a 6-year lead on Iron Maiden to kind of explore and produce music with Rock-a-Rolla, Sad Wings of Destiny, Sin After Sin, Stained Class, Killing Machine, and then they obviously hit it big, like I said, with British Steel in 1980. But Maiden, they are one of the most important heavy metal bands. That same list from MTV where they ranked the greatest heavy metal bands, and I said Judas Priest came in at number 2. Iron Maiden was ranked number 4 by the folks at MTV, so I guess there you have it. Judas Priest is better. Thanks for listening, folks. No. We're not gonna just trust the folks at MTV. Their impact can also be seen in pop culture. Iron Maiden, that is, with their mascot Eddie. Eddie's featured on, I'm pretty sure, all the album covers. He's been kind of their mascot, so to speak, for the band. He's an incredibly recognizable symbol in metal. I believe Gibson.com named him the most recognizable symbol in metal. So that's something. Maiden's music has been featured in tons of video games, movies, and they have sold a lot of records. So has Judas Priest, but the number that Maiden had sold was just staggering to me, and we're going to reveal that exact number a little later in the program. They're an incredibly influential metal band, just as Judas Priest is. But a lot of the big four acts, the big four of thrash, has cited in interviews, and there are quotes of them, crediting Iron Maiden for, impacting them and influencing them. Bands like Metallica, Megadeth, and Slayer all, pay some homage to Iron Maiden and, their influence. So both incredibly influential, both British, both heavy metal. Now that means a lot of different things. Heavy metal back then is a lot different than what might be considered heavy metal today. So there's kind of a gap there. So when it comes down to a preference, that will play a factor in just kind of what you like. But in terms of legacy, if I had to award 1 point to whoever has the greatest legacy between the two, I'm going to take a second to think about this. The better legacy between Judas Priest and Iron Maiden. I'm going to give it to Judas Priest just because they've been around a little longer and they have that fashion influence as well as the impact of their music and the, high selling, the high volume that their music was sold in. So I'm going to say Judas Priest had the slightly greater legacy, not to discredit Iron Maiden's legacy, because I think that is still equally impressive. So I think when we're talking about, bands and stuff like this, I think one important thing to compare, we're talking about the music, right? So that should be kind of front and center when we're comparing an act like Judas Priest or Iron Maiden. So some of the top tracks, we'll just kind of lay it out here. Some of my favorite Judas Priest tracks include Breaking the Law, You've Got Another Thing Coming, Painkiller, Living After Midnight, Electric Eye. Oh my goodness, that riff is phenomenal. And some of the early stuff is good. As I mentioned earlier, I like to like listen through bands from the start of their career. So I did that with Judas Priest last year. I missed Rockarola. I don't know if I just missed it or if it just got recently added on Spotify, but I haven't listened to that one, but I listened to Sin After Sin. There was a few ones I liked on there, and then we got into Stained Class, which I did enjoy. Hellbent for Leather was good. And then, like I said, British Steel. I mean, Rapid Fire, Metal Gods, Breaking the Law, United, You Don't Have to Be Old to Be Wise, Living After Midnight, The Rage, Steeler, Red, White, and Blue. Those were all phenomenal songs. I mean, Living After Midnight and Breaking the Law are probably two of their biggest songs. And then we move on to Point of Entry, which has like Heading Out on the Highway, You Say Yes, Screaming for Vengeance, Electric Eye, Take These Chains. You've got Another Thing Coming, which, just like Breaking the Law and Living After Midnight, are some of their biggest tracks and are the ones most likely to get radio play. The Defenders of the Faith. I didn't actually listen to Turbo. Perhaps I should have. I don't know why I skipped Turbo. But then there's Ram It Down, and then obviously Painkiller, which is Priest's attempt to kind of keep up with the heavy metal and how metal was shifting from how it was when Priest started. It had gotten more intense, and that was Priest's kind of way of saying, yo, we can still play like this. And Painkiller is just a gnarly record, man. I mean, I think what happened when I listened to Painkiller, I didn't get to the end, so there's like 3 or 4 songs I just didn't listen to, whether I got pulled away or distracted with something else. But like the first 6 to 7 tracks are all solid. Those are all amazing tracks. I mean, Painkiller, if you haven't heard that track as a metal fan, you're doing yourself a disservice, my friend. But those are some of my favorites from Judas Priest. If we're comparing that, like I said, I use Spotify, so it will tell me here that I have liked 52 songs by Judas Priest. So now let's go over to Iron Maiden to compare here. So Maiden, some of my favorite songs, The Trooper, with over 205 million plays across the platform. The Trooper is a fantastic song. Run to the Hills, another great song. The Number of the Beast, off of the Number of the Beast album. And the Number of the Beast, it is a human number. Its number is 666. Just to kind of hop off on a side tangent here, sidetrack, neither band was kind of... Each band had dealt with their own separate controversy. Maiden was definitely relative to like Satanism in their music and stuff like that. And then Priest, actually, they stood trial, I believe. Let me pull this up. So they were on trial for subliminal messaging in their music. They were the subject of a civil action in the United States, which alleged that the band was responsible for an incident in Sparks, Nevada in 1985, in which 20-year-old James Vance and 18-year-old Raymond Belknap shot themselves. On the evening of December 23rd, 1985, Vance and Belknap went to a church playground with a 12-gauge shotgun with the purpose of committing suicide. They had consumed alcohol and marijuana earlier that evening. The lawsuit alleged that the pair had been listening to Judas Priest's 1978 album Stained Class that night. Belknap was the first to place the shotgun under his chin and died instantly after pulling the trigger. Sometime later, Vance also shot himself, but succeeded only in disfiguring himself by blowing away the lower half of his face. Vance died 3 years later after complications from the injuries. So, lawyers representing the Belknap and Vance families alleged that a subliminal message urging them to do it had been embedded in the song Better by You, Better Than Me, a cover of a 1969 Spooky Tooth song. Judas Priest had recorded the cover at the urging of this record company after the rest of Stained Class had been completed. Prosecutors alleged that this subliminal command was the trigger which led directly to the pair deciding to shoot themselves. Vance's parents claimed that their son had been troubled for a long time prior to the suicide pact, but had recently changed for the better and had re-embraced his family's Christian faith before the quote-unquote garbage music of Judas Priest had again led him astray. The trial lasted from July 16th to the 24th of August, 1990, when the lawsuit was dismissed by the judge, who ruled that the so-called subliminal message was a coincidental convergence of a guitar chord with an exhalation pattern. One of the defense witnesses, Dr. Timothy E. Moore, wrote an article for the Skeptical Inquirer chronicling the trial. The trial was covered in a 1991 documentary film, Dream Deceivers, the story behind James Vance versus Judas Priest. So, I just read that off the Wikipedia page. I knew they were on trial for something, but now you and I both know the details, but I think that definitely reflects a time when metal music was kind of on the defense. It was under a lot of, not necessarily, I would say actually, hatred and kind of a lot of strong dislike from parents and people in the Christian community. But Iron Maiden, as I said, was not without their share of controversy. In 1982, the band released one of their most popular, controversial, and acclaimed albums, The Number of the Beast. The artwork and title track led to Christian groups in the United States branding the band as Satanists, encouraging people to destroy copies of the release. Ah yes, destroying artwork. The band's manager, Rod Smallwood, later commented that Christians initially burnt the records, but later decided to destroy them with hammers through fear of breathing in the melting vinyl fumes. The protests were not restricted to the U.S., with Christian organizations preventing Iron Maiden from performing in Chile in 1992, or Chile. Contrary to the accusations, the band have always denied the notion that they were Satanists, with lead vocalist Bruce Dickinson doing so on stage in the Live After Death concert video. Steve Harris has since commented that it was mad. They completely got the wrong end of the stick. They obviously haven't read the lyrics. They just wanted to believe all that rubbish about us being Satanists. Harris had also stated that The Number of the Beast song was inspired by a nightmare he had after watching Damien, Omen 2, and also influenced by Robert Burns' Tam O'Shanter. Furthermore, the band's drummer, Nico McBrain, sorry if I got that name wrong, has been a born-again Christian since 1999. So, again, Satan in metal was a big thing in the 80s. And Iron Maiden and Judas Priest both kind of played a role in different controversy. They both had their share of controversy. But back, I was talking about Iron Maiden's, some of my favorite songs by them, and I got to Number of the Beast, and that just threw me off. Wasted Years, 2 Minutes to Midnight, Aces High. I did the same thing where I started with Iron Maiden's first album, which did not have Bruce Dickinson as the lead singer. Paul Di'Anno was the singer on the first two albums, Iron Maiden and Killers. And there's nothing wrong with those albums, but I think when people think of Iron Maiden, they don't think of the Paul Di'Anno era. They think of starting with Number of the Beast. And the Number of the Beast is an iconic cover. I mean, Maiden's... Well, we should talk about the logos for both bands, just kind of compare. But Number of the Beast is an iconic album. Invaders, Children of the Damned, The Prisoner, The Number of the Beast, Run to the Hills. Hallowed Be Thy Name is nice, but maybe I should give that one another listen. And then the album that follows The Number of the Beast, Peace of Mind, is my personal favorite Iron Maiden album, where Eagles Dare, Revelations, Flight of Icarus, Die With Your Boots On, The Trooper, Still Life, Sun and Steel, and To Tame a Land. Those are some of my favorite tracks off of Peace of Mind. That one is a very solid album, released in 1983. Power Slave is another great album. Live After Death, which I actually haven't listened to, but I think I might, is considered one of the great live albums of all time. Then there's Somewhere in Time, and then they do another live album, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, No Prayers for the Dying, and Fear of the Dark, released in 1992. Then things kind of start to shift in terms of who's in the band and who isn't, but Maiden keeps on going, and they even had just released an album. It looks like it was a live album, Knights of the Dead, Legacy of the Beast, live in Mexico City. They released that in 2020, so Maiden is still going strong, as is Judas Priest. Judas Priest had a tour planned with Ozzy Osbourne for 2020, but we all know what happened to tours in 2020. So I believe that tour is still in the works, and things are going to be happening likely with both bands. So both bands, like I said, they still are going. They still have the longevity on their side. So, better live act, Judas Priest. They had performed at Live Aid, which, if you know anything about Live Aid, was 1985, a concert to raise money for famine in Africa with many, many star-studded acts performing. So Judas Priest took part in that. Stage antics that they use on stage. Halford riding a motorcycle on stage. They have, that's part of their stage act. I think Judas Priest on stage is a little more straightforward. Set up their stuff, we play, here we go. They have created 6 live albums over the entirety of their career, so there's something to be said about that. Iron Maiden has produced a little more than 6 live albums. They produced 13 live albums, and as of October 2019 have played over 2,500 shows. They have often had elaborate stage shows, which with very grandiose effects and large pyrotechnics and different kind of displays to kind of go along with different songs and different themes. And like I said, Live After Death is considered one of the greatest live albums of all time. So if I had to give it into a better live act, I would probably lean towards Iron Maiden. Now, if we're talking in the previous category where I listed off, who I prefer musically, well, like I said, I've liked 52 tracks by Judas Priest, and my liked songs, I have liked 43 songs by Iron Maiden. So, I have liked a greater number of Judas Priest songs. But I do still like those Iron Maiden songs. And when I was preparing for the show, I like to take my notes, and I like to pre-show notes to write them out, so I am not coming on and recording this totally flustered, so I kind of have a direction of what I'm going to talk about. And at the end, I left blank. My choice is, or my pick, I didn't want to make it until the time of recording. And I'm not quite ready to make it, but I'm thinking it's becoming a little more clear to me. So lastly, we're going to take a look at just kind of record sales, which kind of, I guess, could indicate popularity. So Judas Priest has sold over 50 million albums. I mean, that's a whopping total right there. I believe that is a worldwide total, not just in the United States. So that's worldwide, 50 million albums. Judas Priest, they have produced more albums than Iron Maiden, I believe. Let me just give it a goog. So they've made 18 studio albums. Let's check on how many Iron Maiden has made. So Judas Priest with 18 albums. Iron Maiden with 16. So fairly close, but I guess Judas Priest, well, not I guess, 18 is greater than 16. So Judas Priest has a slight leg up there. But the sales are not particularly close. So like I said, Judas Priest has sold over 50 million albums worldwide. That's great. That's impressive. Iron Maiden has sold over 100 million albums worldwide. That is double what Judas Priest had sold. So the sales, it's not a very close comparison. If the data and the numbers that I'm pulling are correct, then, it's clear who has the leg up in terms of sales. But with all that being said, that's not always an indicator of personal preference or anything like that, but I think it is a valid indicator of who's more popular. And if we look at the Spotify monthly listeners, Iron Maiden has 6.2 million monthly listeners, while Judas Priest pulls in 3.6 million monthly listeners. So if we're looking at sales, you got to give the nod to Iron Maiden. Numbers do not lie there. Let me just see. Take these chains, take the da-na-na-na. Judas Priest song called Take These Chains off of Screaming for Vengeance. A very, 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 very good song. I had something on Iron Maiden's record sales, but I am struggling to find it. I apologize, folks. Okay. Maybe it was at the top of the page here. Okay. It was. I have found what I'm looking for. So... I apologize for this. I'm a mess. I gotta get my shit together. So by 2017, Iron Maiden had sold over 100 million copies of their albums worldwide, despite little radio or television support. According to MD Daily Records, by 2021, all audiovisual releases of the bands have sold in over 200 million copies worldwide, including regular albums, singles, VHS, DVDs, and all compilations. So Maiden, I don't know what it is, but they have outsold Judas Priest. That much is clear. So, record sales would give the nod to Maiden. Best tracks, I give the nod to Priest. The better live act, I give the nod to Maiden. The legacy, I had considered a tie, but I think... I gotta give the nod to Priest just because they're one of the founders of metal. I mean, metal might not even be considered what it is without Judas Priest, even though it's maybe a little better cited, like with the big four of thrash saying, yeah, Maiden influenced us. So I think I'd give that nod to Priest. So I've got Priest for legacy, Priest for tracks, Maiden for live acts, and Maiden for sales. So my final thoughts here are both bands... They bring something very special to the table, and they bring something incredibly influential and incredibly important to the metal genre. They bring all of those things to the table. They both also bring a different sound. So if I had to create a recommendation for somebody on which band to listen to based on what you prefer, if you prefer something more rock-based, maybe a thicker sound, I would say go Judas Priest. Because either way, you're getting high-pitched vocals and you're getting, impressive vocal range. So you kind of got to live with that. If you prefer something more melodic, with a thick bass line underneath, because, Iron Maiden is, Steve Harris kills it in the bass department at Iron Maiden. He's probably one of the greatest bassists of all time. Then I would say go Maiden if you're more into the, how do I describe it? Melodic stuff. The more kind of, it's not as heavy, but it's still metal. It's a different type of metal. So that's how I would just kind of phrase it, and that's how I would kind of put it for anybody who's unfamiliar with either. They both have great consistency. They both have great music. And honestly, if I could pick both, I would pick both. But I'm not going to pick a tie. That's just a cop-out answer. So my pick... long awaited. I have been thinking about this. I took a whole night to sleep on it. My pick is Judas Priest, for which band I prefer. For a while there, I was a Maiden guy. I kind of preferred Maiden. I guess that's when I was deep into listening to them. I kind of cooled off on listening to both acts, and I guess now that I've kind of had some time to simmer and it's kind of settled down in my brain, I can confirm I prefer Judas Priest over Iron Maiden. So... That's it. That's my answer, and I'm sticking to it. What do you guys think? Be sure to let me know. As I said, you can message me on the Instagram page for the podcast, Owen's Rock and Metal Podcast, or you can message me on my personal page, OwenW409. Let me know. I want to have interaction with you guys. I think it's great. So yeah, that's all we got today for episode 14. Next week, episode 15, we're going to be talking about one of the greatest rock albums of all time. That is 1979's Highway to Hell from AC/DC, the last album to feature Bon Scott. So be sure to tune in next week for that album, and as always, or that podcast rather, and as always, never stop rockin'.